What happens when Hollywood's most notoriously private legend meets a host who just won't quit pushing boundaries? You won't believe what unfolds when Harrison Ford sits down with Jimmy Kimmel for what was supposed to be a routine promotional appearance, only to witness one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. The tension that built throughout this interview will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about celebrity interviews gone wrong. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two entertainment titans clash in ways that will have the entire industry talking. The stage was set for what appeared to be another typical Tuesday night episode. Harrison Ford, the legendary actor known for his iconic roles as Han Solo and Indiana Jones, had agreed to appear on Jimmy Kimmel Live to promote his latest project. The 81-year-old actor, famously reserved and often uncomfortable with the typical late-night banter, walked onto the set with his characteristic stoic demeanor. The audience erupted in applause as Ford made his way to the guest chair, offering a brief wave before settling in across from Kimmel. From the moment Ford sat down, something felt different. The usual pre-interview warmth that typically exists between host and guest was noticeably absent. Ford's body language was rigid, his jaw set in a way that suggested he was already on edge. Kimmel, seemingly oblivious to the veteran actor's discomfort, launched into his opening with his trademark smirk. Harrison Ford, everybody. The man, the myth, the legend who somehow made flying the Millennium Falcon look easier than parallel parking. Kimmel began, his voice carrying that familiar sardonic tone that had become his signature. The audience laughed, but Ford's expression remained stone-faced. He offered only a slight nod in acknowledgement. "Thanks for having me, Jimmy," Ford replied, his voice carrying a measured politeness that felt forced. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, and his eyes had that distant look that longtime Ford watchers recognize as his defense mechanism against unwanted intrusion. Kimmel dove straight into his prepared material, seemingly determined to extract entertainment value from his notoriously difficult guest. "So Harrison, I have to ask, and I know the fans are dying to know this, at 81, are you finally ready to admit that you're too old to be doing your own stunts? I mean, come on, we've all seen those videos of you hobbling around set." The question landed with an uncomfortable thud. Ford's jaw tightened visibly, and for a moment, the only sound in the studio was the nervous shuffling of the audience. This wasn't the gentle ribbing that late-night television thrives on. This felt personal, almost cruel. Ford had always been sensitive about aging in Hollywood, and Kimmel had just poked directly at that insecurity on national television. "I do what the role requires, Jimmy," Ford responded, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "I've been doing this for 50 years, and I think I know my limitations better than anyone else in this room." The words came out measured, but there was an unmistakable warning beneath them. Kimmel, however, seemed to interpret Ford's discomfort as comedic gold rather than a red flag. He leaned forward with that mischievous grin that his regular viewers knew meant trouble was brewing. "Come on, Harrison, lighten up. I'm just saying, maybe it's time to let the stunt doubles earn their paychecks. I mean, watching you try to run in the latest Indiana Jones movie was like watching my grandfather chase after the ice cream truck." The studio audience's laughter felt forced now, as if they could sense the growing tension but weren't sure how to react. Ford's face had gone from stoic to genuinely annoyed, his legendary composure beginning to crack under Kimmel's relentless needling. "You know what, Jimmy," Ford said, his voice dropping to that gravelly tone that had intimidated countless directors over the decades. "Maybe we should talk about something else. Isn't that what these interviews are supposed to be about? The work? The craft?" But Kimmel was on a roll now, feeding off what he mistakenly believed was playful banter. "Oh, the craft. Right. Let's talk about the craft of cashing those Disney checks. I mean, how many times can you play the same character before even you get bored? Indiana Jones, Han Solo, basically the same guy in different costumes, am I right?" The question hit Ford like a slap. Here was a host, on national television, essentially dismissing his entire career as formulaic cash grabs. The audience could feel the shift in energy. What had started as an awkward interview was quickly transforming into something much more volatile. Ford sat forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he fixed Kimmel with a stare that had intimidated everyone from studio executives to co-stars throughout his legendary career. You want to talk about formula, Jimmy? Let's talk about your formula. Night after night, the same tired jokes, the same desperate attempts to go viral by making your guests uncomfortable. Is that what you call craft? The studio fell silent. This wasn't banter anymore. This was a direct challenge. Kimmel's smile flickered for just a moment, revealing a flash of genuine surprise beneath his practiced television persona. He had pushed countless celebrities into uncomfortable territory before, but Ford was pushing back in a way that caught him completely off guard. Whoa, Harrison, Kimmel said, trying to recover his composure with a nervous laugh. I'm just having some fun here. That's what we do on late-night television. It's all in good fun. Good fun. Ford's voice was rising now, his legendary temper finally beginning to surface. Good fun is when both people are enjoying themselves. Jimmy, this feels more like you're trying to humiliate me for your own entertainment. The camera operators were having a field day, zooming in on Ford's increasingly agitated expression and then cutting to Kimmel's face, which was showing the first signs of panic as he realized his usual tactics weren't working on this particular guest. Kimmel, desperately trying to regain control of the situation, made what would prove to be a catastrophic decision. Instead of backing down or changing the subject, he doubled down on his approach, apparently believing he could salvage the segment with even more aggressive humor. Look, Harrison, I get it. Nobody likes getting older. But hey, at least you're not doing those Blade Runner sequels anymore. I mean, that was painful to watch. You look like you'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Ford's face went completely white, then flushed red with anger. Blade Runner 2049 had been a project he'd actually cared deeply about, a chance to revisit one of his most challenging roles with the wisdom and experience of age. For Kimmel to dismiss it so casually, so cruelly, was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That's enough, Ford said quietly, but his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. The studio audience could sense that something significant was about to happen, and the energy in the room had shifted from uncomfortable comedy to genuine confrontation. But Jimmy Kimmel, perhaps sensing that his show was spiraling out of control, or perhaps just unable to abandon his comedic instincts, made one final, devastating mistake that would transform this awkward interview into the television event of the year. Kimmel leaned back in his chair with that insufferable smirk that had become his trademark, clearly believing he could salvage the situation with one last joke. You know what, Harrison? Maybe you're right. Maybe I should stick to interviewing people who can actually take a joke. I hear Mark Hamill's available. At least he knows how to have fun with his legacy instead of being so precious about it. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Bringing up Mark Hamill, Ford's Star Wars co-star who had embraced social media and fan culture in ways Ford never could, was the ultimate insult. It wasn't just a professional slight. It was a personal attack on Ford's character, suggesting he was somehow less worthy than his peers because he valued privacy and dignity over publicity stunts. Ford's face transformed completely. The controlled anger that had been simmering beneath the surface erupted into something much more dangerous. His hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles went white, and when he spoke, his voice carried a menace that made everyone in the studio freeze. You want to bring Mark into this? Ford's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more threat than any shout. You want to sit there and compare me to my friends, like some kind of playground bully trying to start a fight? The camera caught every micro-expression on Ford's face, the way his eyes narrowed to slits, the way his jaw worked as he fought to maintain some semblance of professional composure. This was Harrison Ford unleashed, and it was terrifying to witness. Kimmel, finally beginning to realize the magnitude of his mistake, tried to backtrack. Harrison, I didn't mean. No, you meant exactly what you said. Ford cut him off, his voice gaining strength and fury with each word. You meant to diminish me, to make me look like some bitter old man who can't handle a little ribbing. You meant to humiliate me on national television for the sake of your ratings. The studio audience was dead silent now. The usual sounds of a live taping, the rustle of papers, the quiet conversations of crew members, the hum of equipment, all seemed to have been sucked out of the room by the intensity of Ford's anger. That's not what Kimmel started. Again, but Ford was beyond listening to excuses. You know what your problem is, Jimmy. Ford said, leaning forward in his chair like a predator preparing to strike. You think because you have this platform, this show, that it gives you the right to tear people down for entertainment. You think you can hide behind, it's just comedy, while you systematically attack everything someone has worked for their entire life. Kimmel's face had gone pale. The confident late-night host who had made a career out of making celebrities squirm was now the one squirming, and every camera in the studio was capturing his discomfort for posterity. I've been doing this longer than you've been alive, Ford continued, his voice building to a crescendo that filled the entire studio. I've worked with directors who actually respected the craft, who understood that making movies is about more than getting laughs from an audience that doesn't know any better. I've spent 50 years building something, and you think you can just tear it down with your cheap shots and your desperate attempts to stay relevant. The words hit Kimmel like physical blows. Ford wasn't just angry. He was eloquent in his fury, dismantling not just Kimmel's interview technique, but his entire approach to entertainment with surgical precision. Harrison, please, Kimmel said, his voice cracking slightly. Can we just what? Ford snapped. Can we just pretend this didn't happen? Can we just smile and shake hands and pretend you didn't spend the last 10 minutes trying to destroy my reputation for the sake of a few cheap laughs? The studio cameras were working overtime now, capturing every angle of this unprecedented meltdown. Ford's publicist, visible in the wings, was making frantic gestures to the producers, clearly trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. But Ford was beyond management now, beyond the careful handling that had protected his public image for decades. You want to know the difference between me and Mark Hamill? Ford said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper again. Mark chooses to engage with this circus. I choose to maintain some dignity. But apparently, that makes me the bad guy in your twisted little world. Kimmel was desperately looking to his producers for guidance, but they seemed as frozen as everyone else in the studio. This was uncharted territory, a complete breakdown of the careful balance that made late-night television work. The truth is, Ford continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, you're nothing but a playground bully who never grew up. You hide behind that desk and that audience and those writers, but strip all that away, and what are you? Just another small man trying to make himself feel big by making others feel small. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Ford had just called out Kimmel not just as a host, but as a human being, and the indictment was devastating in its accuracy. Every person in that studio could see the truth of it written across Kimmel's face. I don't think that's fair, Kimmel managed to say, but his voice lacked any conviction. He looked like a child who had been caught bullying and was now facing the consequences. Fair, Ford laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to talk about fair? Is it fair to invite someone onto your show under the pretense of promoting their work, then spend the entire time attacking their age, their career choices, their legacy? Is that your idea of fair? The silence that followed was deafening. Ford had laid out the case against Kimmel with the precision of a prosecutor, and there was no defense that could possibly justify what had transpired. You know what the really sad part is, Jimmy? Ford said, his voice taking on an almost pitying tone that was somehow worse than his anger. You had a chance here. You had Harrison Ford on your show, someone who's been in this business since before you were born, someone who's worked with the greatest directors and actors of multiple generations. You could have had a real conversation. You could have learned something. Instead, you chose to be exactly what everyone already thinks you are. Kimmel's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. For perhaps the first time in his career, the professional talker had nothing to say. Ford had stripped away every defense, every excuse, every justification, leaving him exposed and helpless before an audience that was witnessing his complete professional humiliation. I've sat through a lot of bad interviews in my time, Ford said, standing up from his chair with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who had made a decision. But this is something else entirely. The entire studio held its breath as Ford rose to his full height, towering over the seated Kimmel like a judgment from above. The cameras captured every second, every angle, as one of Hollywood's most legendary figures prepared to deliver what would become the most talked-about moment in late-night television history. But what Ford did next would shock everyone in that studio and create a moment that would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms worldwide. Ford reached into his jacket pocket and slowly, deliberately, pulled out the small wireless microphone pack that every guest was required to wear. The simple action carried the weight of finality. This wasn't just a pause in the interview. This was Ford formally ending his participation in what he clearly viewed as a professional assassination. "You know what, Jimmy?" Ford said, his voice carrying across the silent studio with crystal clarity. "I've been in this business for 5 decades. I've worked with directors who demanded excellence, actors who respected the craft, and audiences who understood the difference between entertainment and exploitation." He held up the microphone pack, letting it dangle from his fingers like a piece of evidence in a trial. The cameras zoomed in on the small device, understanding instinctively that this moment would become iconic. "This little device has carried my voice into millions of homes over the years," Ford continued, his tone taking on the gravitas of a courtroom closing argument. "It's carried stories of adventure, of heroism, of characters who meant something to people. Tonight, it was going to carry the voice of someone promoting work he believed in, work he was proud of." Kimmel sat frozen in his chair, looking like a man watching his career implode in real time. The confident host who had started the evening, ready to extract entertainment from his guests' discomfort, was now completely powerless, reduced to a spectator at his own professional execution. "Instead," Ford said, looking directly into the main camera with those piercing eyes that had captivated audiences for generations, "it carried the sound of a grown man trying to tear down another person for laughs. It carried cruelty disguised as comedy. It carried everything that's wrong with this industry." The silence in the studio was so complete that the faint hum of the air conditioning system seemed deafening. Every person present, from the camera operators to the producers to the audience members, understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. Ford looked down at Kimmel with an expression that somehow combined disappointment, disgust, and pity in equal measure. "You had Harrison Ford on your show, Jimmy. You had Indiana Jones, Han Solo, Rick Deckard. You had someone who's been part of the most beloved films in cinema history. And you chose to spend that opportunity trying to humiliate him." The weight of what Kimmel had squandered hit everyone in the room simultaneously. This wasn't just an interview gone wrong. This was a historic opportunity wasted, a chance to connect with a living legend thrown away for cheap laughs. "I've sat across from Johnny Carson, from David Letterman, from real professionals who understood that their job was to showcase their guests, not destroy them," Ford continued. "Those men knew the difference between humor and cruelty. They knew that their role was to be a bridge between the audience and the people they were interviewing, not a barrier." Ford's words were hitting Kimmel like hammer blows. Each comparison to legendary hosts made his own behavior seem even more petty and unprofessional by contrast. "But you," Ford said, his voice dripping with contempt, "you're not a host. You're a predator. You lure people onto this stage with promises of promotion and partnership, then you attack them for sport." Kimmel finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Harrison, I think you're overreacting." "Overreacting?" Ford's voice exploded across the studio. "Overreacting? You spent 15 minutes attacking my age, my career, my choices, my colleagues, and my legacy, and you think I'm overreacting?" The fury in Ford's voice was magnificent and terrible. This wasn't just anger. This was righteous indignation from a man who had spent his entire career maintaining dignity in an industry that constantly tried to strip it away. "Let me tell you something about overreacting, Jimmy," Ford said, taking a step closer to Kimmel's desk. "Overreacting would be me telling this audience about the conversations I've had with other actors about your show. Overreacting would be me sharing what people really think about your interview style when the cameras aren't rolling." Kimmel's face went ashen. The implication was clear. Ford wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for countless celebrities who had endured similar treatment at Kimmel's hands. "Overreacting would be me explaining to your viewers how you and your writers spend your prep time looking for ways to embarrass your guests rather than ways to showcase their work," Ford continued, his voice building to a crescendo. "Overreacting would be me telling them how you've turned what should be a celebration of creativity into a gladiator arena where you're always the one holding the sword." The condemnation was complete and devastating. Ford had just exposed the ugly machinery behind Kimmel's success, revealing the calculated cruelty that masqueraded as entertainment. "But I'm not going to overreact," Ford said, his voice suddenly dropping to that dangerous whisper again. "I'm going to do something much worse. I'm going to leave." He held up the microphone pack one final time, looking at it as if it were something distasteful he needed to dispose of. "This microphone has been my connection to audiences for 50 years, Ford said. "Tonight, it became a tool for my humiliation. I won't let that stand." With a movement that was both gentle and final, Ford set the microphone pack down on Kimmel's desk. The soft click of plastic against wood seemed to echo through the studio like a gunshot. "Goodbye, Jimmy," Ford said, his voice carrying absolute finality. "I hope someday you figure out the difference between being funny and being cruel. For your sake, and for the sake of everyone who has to sit in that chair after me." Ford turned away from Kimmel's desk and began walking toward the exit. His movements were unhurried, dignified, purposeful. This wasn't a storming off in anger. This was a measured withdrawal by a man who had made a principled decision. The cameras followed his every step, capturing the straight line of his shoulders, the determined set of his jaw, the way he acknowledged no one as he made his way across the stage. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply witness in silence. As Ford reached the edge of the stage, he paused and turned back one final time. The camera caught him in profile, his legendary face set in an expression that would become the defining image of the entire confrontation. "You know what the tragedy is here, Jimmy?" Ford called back across the studio. "You had a chance to be part of something meaningful tonight. Instead, you chose to be part of the problem." With those words, Harrison Ford walked off the stage and out of the studio, leaving behind a host who looked utterly destroyed, an audience that didn't know how to react, and a moment that would define both men's careers in ways neither could have anticipated. The cameras lingered on Kimmel's face, capturing every emotion as it played across his features: shock, embarrassment, anger, and finally, a dawning realization of what he had just lost. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of Ford's footsteps disappearing down the hallway. When Kimmel finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. We'll be right back after this break." But everyone in that studio knew that there would be no coming back from what had just happened. Harrison Ford had walked away, taking with him not just his own dignity, but any pretense that what had occurred on that stage was entertainment rather than exploitation. The interview was over, but the consequences were just beginning.